and gentlemen, welcome back to AA Media. Today I have the pleasure to have with me Dr. Courtney teaching my class Persuasion, and I'm very excited to talk about that class, Professor. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I mean, first semester, I really wanted to take like communication classes, and I decided to take public speaking, not related with my major at all. But it helped me so much with like communication skills. And even after like my first internship, I noticed that class had a lot of impact. And then I found this class called Persuasion. And I was like, maybe this one will help me build more of those skills that I wanted. From your experience as a teacher, do you think this class is really valuable in terms of like providing students with like even post-graduation skills that they can use later on?
I think all the advanced communication classes that we teach have the capacity to do that. What I think is unique about Persuasion as a class is that you get a lot of versatile skills and you get the underlying theory about how people are persuaded, how we process messages, how our attitudes and values and beliefs impact our behavior and impact what we find persuasive. So it's a fun class to teach. I teach that in business communication, which is another advanced communication course. But I love that Persuasion is really about like storytelling, but also, you know, key social issues. And then again, like defining someone's legacy, we get to really explore a wide variety of speech making.
I agree. And one thing that I noticed in the class was how well defined were some of the concepts that before I was just, oh, I know that word. For example, attitude. We spend maybe like half a class on just the definition of it, and then values, and then beliefs. So for the audience who maybe is interested in those terms or concepts that we define in Persuasion, how can we like send that message to them?
Yeah, I would say, you know, we talk about values as these set of like repeated learnings that we get growing up that help us form key attitudes. And attitudes are really our initial positive or negative response to something. Those value systems and then those attitudes come to impact our beliefs, which occur in specific moments, right? So the example that I give in class is that you might really value open-mindedness, and so you have a tendency to respond positively to someone who exhibits open-mindedness and maybe respond negatively, like have an affective response that's negative to someone who is maybe more closed-minded. And so your specific belief is generated in a moment when you meet a new roommate or something, and whether or not they exhibit that, you might have an emotional response to them that's based in that attitude.
It's so interesting to hear it from you in person, like in one-on-one, because when you were describing this in the class, all I could think of was like my personal experiences of like, wait, I've done that before. This makes so much sense. And I think another thing that I learned in your class that kind of helped me describe a lot of things was the functional value theorem.
Yeah, I love that one.
I think it's also one of my favorite. And the reason why so is that it has such a good grouping of reasons why we do things the way that we do. And I've noted them down for the audience too. Like usually when we do a behavior or when we exhibit like an attitude, the reason why we kind of do it is that we want to like gain more knowledge, for maybe social adjustive reasons, or social identity, value expressions. And I wonder, how did people kind of start studying these reasons? How did they even start discovering that we do certain things because of these categories that they have defined in functional value theorem?
So I think that scholars who study functional theory really wanted to understand the underlying benefit or need that a certain cognition or a certain attitude, like where that was coming from, right? And so so those can sort of change based on situation, but you know, for instance, like religion helps people organize their world. It helps us understand big questions about life and death and other things. And so for some people, religion really responds to like how they want to understand themselves moving in the world. And so if we can take that seriously as people who, you know, are attempting to influence how other people think in positive, negative ways, then then yeah, you're really kind of adapting to your audience and you're understanding what the needs are, why they feel the way they feel, and therefore like how you can craft a message that taps that emotional response and that really seeks to target that underlying benefit of a given attitude or a given belief.
Interesting. And this plays very well with the other thing that we learned in class, which is the social judgment theory. And I know if this is repetitive because it sounds like we're kind of like just going back.
No, this is great. Yeah.
Concepts,
it's a lot of theories. And and none of them, is all right or all wrong, but they're considerations that you can have when you're crafting messages to try to understand like where people are coming from, right?
I totally agree. So understanding that audience and what is their context behind, I think it's super crucial. For example, with the social judgment theory, we learned that there's anchor where the person stands. This is like I love that this sounds like a review. And then we have the...
You're really amping up for the next exam, huh? You're going to be ready.
I'm super excited because this is not even studying for me. This is like what I do in my free time as well, because I love learning about like social sciences a little bit, even though like I'm very STEM focused.
Yeah.
But as I was saying, we have anchor where the person stays, latitude of acceptance, and then latitude of rejection. So kind of assessing the other person that you talk to. What is their latitude of accepting a message? For example, my roommate is not really interested in soccer, for example. If I was to propose to him an activity of playing soccer, his latitude of rejection, probably would not encompass that. But he likes basketball, so like anything related with that, his latitude of acceptance would be including it. And to me, it's really interesting because before I used to know that, but I never defined it. We never had like labels or terms for it. And I think once you do that, you kind of gain like a very valuable skill that I think it's useful for all the students.
Yeah, social judgment theory is great because what it says is that what really matters is not that someone just comes and like imparts wisdom or information or persuasion on us, but instead that where we sort of start, like where our value systems start, is going to influence how likely we are to accept or reject a given message, right? And so there are some messages that we might think of as being like, okay, well, if I frame it this way, then I think that might fall in this person's latitude of acceptance. I think they might accept this message, but they probably are going to reject a more intensely held position or something like that. And so social judgment theory really asks us to meet people where they are and to consider what our goals are as communicators and adapt those goals to where people are.
Yeah. I think a very important distinction to make is where is kind of like the difference between persuasion and manipulation. Because this is like a personal example. I was telling my friend that, I'm taking this super cool class called Persuasion, and like I'm learning so much about how people like to receive messages and all about the like different theorems. And he was like, yeah, but like who are you going to manipulate next? And I'm like, I don't think those two things are necessarily the same. And I would love for you to kind of like dispel that myth that persuasion means manipulation at the same time.
Sure. I think effective persuasion, and I think that the way that we teach this in the communication department is adapting to your audience. The one thing I try to emphasize in each applied communication course I teach is audience is most important. And that doesn't mean pandering and that doesn't mean manipulation. What that means is, who is your audience? Can you be generous in your assessment of them? And can you look for points of connection? So considering your audience as real people who have kind of real benefits or functions to the attitudes or values or beliefs that they hold, how do we then craft a message that will resonate best with them? And I think that particularly right now, that's a really important skill set to develop. I do think historically, like even in ancient Greece, right, this was always at the heart of persuasion. Yeah. So, persuasion has always been something that Plato, for instance, was really suspicious of because he thought persuasion was going to be used as manipulation, that it wasn't going to be helpful, that it wasn't going to be used in connective ways, that it didn't really have substance, that it was all style, right? That you could just craft pretty words and then people would do what you say. And I think that that doesn't give audiences enough credit. And I think that, again, you could say that about a lot of things, right? Yeah. It's really about the speaker and then the audience and that dynamic. So it's not always going to be manipulation. It can be, just like a number of things can be. But it can also be really useful for connecting in moments of division.
I agree. And I love that you brought back the point about Plato because I think his own student, Aristotle, then disagreed about the usage of rhetoric, as we learned in class. That
Look at you. You are recalling so much.
No, and Aristotle was super interesting when he started defining that people can be persuaded by 3 ways: ethos, pathos, and logos. And I'm sure like a lot of people at Vandy might have heard of those 3 terms. And I've been kind of like playing with them around just in general when I give speeches or presentations. And it's interesting what I've noted, and you can like share your own experience on this, is that ethos is that the credibility one. The credibility one is the strongest for me when I'm needing to convince an audience for like a long-term concept. Logos is the best one when I'm dealing with like STEM related areas or people who like to process things centrally, not peripherally. And then pathos, which is the emotional appeal, is the most strongest, but in a very short-term format. Because like after you're done with that emotion, you kind of like start to think about it logically, and you're like, oh, maybe that didn't make a lot of sense. I wonder what's your like interpretation of ethos, logos, and pathos?
Yeah, so that's a term that we learn pretty early on, and you're right. Aristotle thought that, so Plato thought that philosophy is where you sought like big truths of the universe and of humanity. And Aristotle said, yeah, philosophy is really important. It's important to think about like how we reason. It's also important to be able to communicate those perspectives. And so rhetoric is equally important. He thought that philosophy and rhetoric were counterparts. And Aristotle is a lot of the reason, at least in the Western study of rhetoric, that that we understand persuasion. And so for him, ethos was even more specific than just credibility. So he thought that there were a few dimensions of ethos. There's phronesis, which is social wisdom or good sense. That is, if you're speaking to an audience that you know is religious, what points of connections can you establish with that audience? What sources might be helpful for communicating your perspective and then also tapping into their worldview, right? There was arete, which is virtue or good character. That is, could you, as a speaker, communicate things accurately? Could you make sure that you were emphasizing, moral frameworks or values that would connect you to your audience? And then eunoia, which is goodwill toward the audience. So could you convince the audience that you had their best interests at heart, right?
Goodwill,
yeah. And so so those, I think, are helpful in a number of capacities and in a number of disciplines. Pathos, of course, is emotions that reside in the audience. And so emotional appeals for many of us help ground our understanding and help connect us to things that may seem really abstract. And so I love that you're sort of connecting it to your experience in STEM, right? And when we talk about like communicating science, how do we make that real to people, right? How do you make something that is big and abstract and seems like it's far away, like climate change? How do you make that feel personal to someone? Well, an appeal to pathos, right? Connecting it to a sort of story or to something that we can feel. And then logic, of course, is always important when we're thinking about better and worse kinds of evidence for a position. So, those concepts are still so important.
Relevant.
Yeah.
And I think I see people use them every day. Like now the presidential election is coming up, and I see kind of like the candidates. I'm not even allowed to vote, by the way, but I'm very interested on how like they communicate with their audiences. And one thing that I was also able to note down from the last chapter that we covered in class about the elaboration likelihood method is that people process messages centrally and peripherally. And centrally is when they actually put the logic and the strength of an argument in their mind, where peripherally is where they use heuristic cues or cues that just give them the quick answers.
Right.
And for me, I think personally, when I'm scrolling on Instagram or TikTok and I see like an ad about a campaign, I don't know much about it. I don't have much of motivation to like be interested about it because I'm not able to vote. So if I see like a very simple cue that tells me that this candidate is good, I'm like, oh, okay, I like this person. But then it's interesting because I see my other friends, like my American friends, that very deeply get into arguments about who has the better policy, who has the better, system of like changing the country. And I'm very interested to hear your perspective on this, on why do people have this, form of like being persuaded in a simple way, like I was from TikTok Reels, but there's also this form of like a very condensed, strong, logical way that my other American friends were persuaded.
Sure. So when we process messages centrally, what that means is we are really engaged in what the message is. So I imagine that as you're talking about your friends, like what's happening is that they have these sort of values that have been built over time, right? Starting from when they were really young. And so their political beliefs also feel really personal because it feels like, you know, we think our parents are good people. And so we like to sort of learn those values from our parents. And politics is one of those things that we learn from parents. And so it feels deeply connected to them, and they are more likely to engage in issues and politics that feel like they're part of their value system, right? And process those messages centrally. But as you said, we also process messages peripherally when they involve less stakes for us, right? When we're not motivated to really engage something in depth. And so like when you're scrolling through Yelp, right, if you're hungry in that moment, then you're going to look at the top 3 and be like, okay, I want pizza tonight,
this
right?
This is what I want.
Yeah. And so, but if you have time to think about it, if you're like, oh, let's make dinner plans for the weekend, and I know I'm going to, you know, take some time with friends, and I want it to be a place that, right, you have more criteria. And so you're probably going to go through Yelp a little more carefully, right? And you're probably going to process more centrally, like which restaurant is going to be the best pick for the sorts of considerations you have. And so it really is context specific, and it's based in your motivations, time, your ability to like do something quickly or not. So yeah, that's helpful.
And this plays very well into connecting to your point of knowing the audience. If you know your audience's involvement in the topic that you're explaining, I think it's very easy to assess whether they're going to perceive your message peripherally or like centrally. And by knowing that, I think it's a skill that you can like kind of start building and adjust your presentation or your speech in that way as well. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was how do people now compared to people maybe like in the past in your class have done in this, you know, persuasion class? Do you think like the attention span now is maybe shorter? Is this new class that you're teaching kind of like evolving much quickly, or would you say like the values and the standards of persuasion have been pretty consistent throughout your teachings?
That's a great question. I don't know that I've reflected carefully on, you know, classes often are really class-to-class basis, so it's not so much like students 8 years ago are different than students now, but it's more like a class dynamic. And so your class has been really great about like asking questions, really being engaged, and that's really fun when we're learning because it feels like people really want to understand the concept. But a lot of things I think impact student involvement, right? Motivation and ability, because when I've taught the class really early and no one's had coffee, everyone's like,
what are we doing?
Can we please just get through this persuasion theory? So, so I don't know that I've noticed essential differences between students, but definitely there are different classes that really want to know and understand the material more, and your class has been great about that.
Oh, well, that's really nice to hear from you. I also saw that you had a PhD in communication from the University of Illinois, and I was curious, what were like the main kind of lessons that you learned through your curriculum there?
Oh, wow, so many. I mean, of course, there's always course content, so you're learning from people who have expertise in particular subjects, but I think most importantly, like graduate school really prepares you for the kind of teacher you're going to be. And so I had so many really great teachers who perform different functions. So my dissertation advisor, John Murphy, is so great at telling stories. He always teaches like historical stuff, but you're just captivated listening to him because he's got so much rich detail because it feels like you're there in a given moment. And then Kara Finnegan, who was also on my dissertation committee, she was always really great at asking questions that made you think. So she would just raise a question And then everyone would just sort of engage with each other. And she was so great at fostering that dynamic. And so I've tried to, I think, take both of those approaches into the classroom so that it can be both like, hey, this stuff is really interesting. Let's talk about it with examples, with like key details, with stories, as much as we can. And also, like, let's have conversations together so that we can learn from each other, because I think that that is the healthiest dynamic in a classroom.
I agree. And I think if there's one thing that I've noticed in communication classes that I haven't necessarily seen in the STEM-related one, particularly to the computer science one, is the opportunity for you to go on a tangent with a professor and then kind of explore a concept in a particular way, not necessarily defined by the presentation slides or by the textbook. And that's why I love this class really much, because sometimes maybe I'm annoying by asking too many questions
not at all.
in class, but I really want to like hear an expert's viewpoint on it. And you do a great job into like explaining concepts in depth and very much like kind of giving us that freedom of like, yeah, I hear you, I understand your point, and kind of like allowing us to express ourselves. So I think I really appreciate that in you. So thank you for that.
Oh, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I mean, I think that part of what's so great about communication as a field of study is that we are interested in the real world, right? We are interested in what people think and how they think it, and, you know, how we can relate to one another and how we become divided from one another. So I actually started out in undergraduate as an English major, as an English literature major, and switched to communication for my master's and my PhD because I loved the fact that we could explore like speeches that I thought had a real impact on people on the way. And again, not just like, oh, someone gave a speech and then we passed this specific policy. Yeah. Sure, that happens sometimes, but also like, oh, this person made me think in a new way about something like civil rights, you know? So Dr. King asks us to think about civil rights as a moral issue and not a political issue. And so the Kennedy administration had been emphasizing civil rights as a political issue. And once King released his letter from a Birmingham jail, the Kennedy administration starts really talking about it as a moral issue in the way that King did. And so I just found that so fascinating, right? That words can ask us to experience different frames of reference and think about things in different ways. And so again, like in the classroom, I love when students bring in like, oh, this makes me think about this thing that I do every day, you know?
That's interesting. I think the last concept I want to talk with you today is the idea of cognitive dissonance. I know that's our next chapter for the class, but I did a little bit of reading because I had like a previous knowledge on it due to this YouTube video that I watched. But then when I read the textbook, it kind of made even more sense. And the ability to hold two incongruent cognitions, attitudes, thoughts, it's a really powerful concept to be aware of. Because I personally am prone of cognitive dissonance sometimes when I want to go to the gym, but that at the same, I want to like eat a cookie, for example, but I know that it's not probably the healthiest choice for me at the point, but I'm still doing it. So that's like a cognitive dissonance moment. Or let's say like you're in a toxic relationship, you know it's not healthy for you, but you love the other person, so you still stay in the relationship. Why do humans do that? Like why are we able to hold a different attitude towards something, but our behavior toward that other thing is not congruent to the attitude?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think that, you know, again, it sort of goes back to what values is a certain situation activating for us, and also what functions or benefits is a particular attitude providing us, right? Or a particular behavior providing us, right? Like cookies taste good. So
especially the rain.
Right. And then also, I mean, and then going to the gym feels good at the end of going to the gym, but it's sort of like staring at a blank page when you're about to write an essay. You know it's going to feel good when the essay's done, but it feels like a lot of work before you do it, right? And so I think, again, that we have to sort of have to accept as a fact that sometimes our attitudes and our behaviors are going to be in conflict. But can we strengthen certain associations, right? So if I know I go to the gym every day at 6 a.m. And that I feel really good after, if you can just repeat that behavior enough, then a positive association becomes more accessible. So I think that that's the way that we maybe deal with cognitive dissonance. But yeah, it's an essential part, really, of the human experience, I think.
I like that. Last question for the podcast, kind of a more personal touch, Professor.
Sure.
What is your main goal into teaching the students in your all classes? Because you teach also like intro to public speaking and business communication, persuasion as well.
Yeah, and I actually teach courses outside of even applied communication courses. So I teach courses in like the history and theories of communication. And I think that I always just want students to understand that people come from different places. People come from different sets of experiences. And that's okay. Like, that's sort of the great thing. It's the great thing about college. It's the great thing about being able to communicate with people. And so, you know, in the applied communication courses, that translates to a focus or an emphasis on audience. In the history and theories classes, it's like, okay, here's where this person's coming from, and we can think about like how we might have responded differently, but at least we can understand that we have different experiences. And again, I just think that is an important starting point for connecting with one another, particularly in this moment.
That's really nice and lovely, and I appreciate your time with me here today. Thanks for all the knowledge that you've shared with me in the class, and thanks for also coming to my podcast, just kind of explaining and kind of going back to the things that we've learned. Again, I appreciate your time with me today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Albi.
Yeah.